Hello, Nick Leifker here, and welcome again to GMGT 590, Operations Management. Well, let's see. So far this week, we've talked about lean processing and all the things that go into that, such as value stream mapping, such as just-in-time production, such as change management. To that end, we've also talked about MRP systems and how those evolved into ERP and why it is so difficult to implement an ERP system. Well, what we're going to talk about now relates to a topic that has its roots in what we've studied so far this semester. When it comes to what we've done, we've encountered a lot of situations where there has been risk that we needed to deal with, where we had variation, where we had uncertainty, and we had to make decisions in the face of that uncertainty, in the face of that variation. What we're going to study today is how to mitigate that risk, how to mitigate that uncertainty. And that is this concept known as risk pooling. So, as with all good problem solving, we first need to start by saying what we want. So what do we want? Well, what we want is we want to reduce risk. We want to reduce the risk of running out of inventory, for instance, without causing significant increases in our inventory. Your call reorder point and safety stock. What if we didn't have to hold as much safety stock? So, what information do we have? Well, we have demand distribution for each location. We have locations. So we have sources of demand, and we have distributions of demand. So what do? How do we combine them? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take advantage of a little bit of information that I've given out here and there, and it's time to talk about the implications of. Now, we're going to study multiple types of risk pooling. That said, we generally consider them to be under 4 different forms. First, we have location pooling. So what we do, we have inventory at a whole bunch of different locations, but instead of having them all over the place, we move them into one central location. That's location pooling. Now, when we move all of these inventories to one central location, well, we find that we don't need to hold as much safety stock. We have product pooling. Here, we have these demand sources of different products. What happens if we decide to combine these products into one? And then we have lead time pooling. Now, both forms of lead time pooling tend to be light versions of other types of risk pooling. For instance, consolidated distribution. This is using a distribution center to reduce the lead time to the customers. Well, this is kind of a light form of location pooling. It's just that there's this intermediary step before it gets to each separate location. In the same way, delayed differentiation is a light form of product pooling. In this case, we still have the separate products, but they're not separate until the very end of the production process. Thus, we can hold this combined inventory into one until we need to separate it out into these different products. And then we have capacity pooling. In capacity pooling, what we do is we allow multiple factories to manufacture multiple products. This way, if we need to adjust our production rates due to demand issues, we can do that. So, here's the question. How does this work? Why does risk pooling work? Well, it relates to something that I've said a number of times before, and has come up on occasion, but that we're really going to get into the nuts and bolts of right now. And that is this idea of that variances. These add, subtract, multiply, divide. Standard deviations, on the other hand, do not. What do I mean by this? I mean that the variance of A plus the variance of B is going to equal the variance of A plus B. However, the standard deviation of A plus the standard deviation of B does not equal the standard deviation of A plus B. Rather, that standard deviation, that combined standard deviation, is going to be the square root of that first standard deviation squared plus the second standard deviation squared. So, because of this, when we combine sources of demand, when we combine these means, when we combine these averages, what we find is that the mean does not increase, that the standard deviation does not increase at the same rate as the mean. The standard deviation increases at a slower rate than the mean. So because of this, if we pool locations, if we pool sources of demand, we effectively have a smaller combined standard deviation than if they were separate, and thus we need a smaller safety stock to serve this demand. Okay, so let's start talking about these different forms of risk pooling. First, we have location pooling. The idea here, we have different inventory sources. We have different inventory locations. And here we have each sales rep has their own inventory to serve their own territory. Now, lead time from the distribution center is 1 day, and that's fine and all, but each territory has its own inventory. What happens if we combine these locations into one central inventory location? Well, once we do this, if all of these sales reps have to use the inventory from the pooled location, what we end up having is, because the standard deviation doesn't increase at the same rate as the mean, because the standard deviation increases at a slower rate than the mean when you start adding these together, you need less safety stock to have as much, to be able to serve the customer in the same way. So you have less safety stock. Like I said, safety stock is inventory. It's a lot like, it's a type of fat basically. And so by needing less, you have less inventory, you have less inventory costs. So what happens by pooling this inventory? Now, well, what happens is we serve the customer as much as we did before, same service level as before. But because the standard deviation doesn't increase at the same rate as the mean, in this case, we go from having almost 12 days of demand in inventory down to 6 days of demand. So we continue to serve the customer in the same way, but we have far less inventory and thus far less inventory costs. In this case, we've cut our inventory almost in half just by consolidating these 3 locations into one. So, what does location pooling allow us to do? Well, you can hold less inventory while keeping the service level constant. You might increase the service level while holding inventory constant, or some combination of the above. Or maybe you could expand the product line. Have more items in inventory, more items available to serve your customers. So, location pooling allows more flexibility, possibly saving cost, while still serving the customer at the same level that you did before. So, what's going on here? We reduce demand uncertainty. Like I said, standard deviation does not increase at the same rate as the mean. So compared to the mean, the standard deviation has increased at a much slower rate. Now doing this reduces the inventory level needed to achieve a target service level. So by combining these locations and keeping them together as opposed to having them separate, you need less inventory to meet a target service level. Now there is one thing to note, and you could see this on the chart a few slides back, and that is that you have declining marginal returns. So what this means is that a little bit of risk pooling goes a long way. So combining a couple of locations, combining a couple of products will get you significant results. The more you do it, though, the less effective those results are. So much of the benefit of risk pooling comes from capturing only a few territories, combining only a couple of products. So again, with risk pooling, a little goes a long way. So, this is nice and great and all. Are there any problems with it? Well, yes. You're moving the inventory away from the customers. That can be a problem. That can make things inconvenient for your sales reps in this case, and it may have additional costs to shipping to the customers. That said, there are alternatives. There are ways of combining things. One is drop shipping, and we'll talk about drop shipping a lot more next week when we get into supply chain management. But also there's this concept of virtual pooling. A good way of thinking about virtual pooling. Back when I was working at Burger King when I was a teenager, occasionally we would run out of things. If we ran out of things, or we were close to running out, we would call up a nearby restaurant, nearby Burger King, and we'd ask, "Hey, you have any spare fries that we could buy?" They would usually say yes, and we would then go up to, somebody'd have to drive to their store, pick up a couple of boxes of fries, and then we would take the boxes back to our restaurant and then use them until our shipment of fries came in and we could replenish. That's what virtual pooling is. You have the inventory at several locations, but those locations are able to share inventory as they need. That's what's meant by virtual pooling. You have the separation of locations, so the inventory is still close to customers, but because multiple locations can access that inventory, you get the benefits of risk pooling. The second type of risk pooling that we're going to look at is called product pooling. And good way of thinking about this. We have separate products. In this case, we have a wetsuit manufacturer named O'Neill, and they sell wetsuits. They're identical except for the logo silk screened on the chest. You have one that's marketed to surfers, one that's marketed to divers. So maybe O'Neill could consolidate things, consolidate both of their wetsuits into a single type of wetsuits, a single type of wetsuit. So, how does this work? Well, each of the demands for each of these suits has a mean and a standard deviation. And we see that here. We have demand for the surf hammer, normally distributed, mean of 3192, standard deviation of 1181. Demand for the dive hammer is the same. These demands are independent. So, the total demand, well, if we were to combine these two, well, the mean would double. It would be 3192 plus 3192, 6384. However, the standard deviation, well, that gets kind of interesting. What that is it's the square root of 1181 squared plus 1181 squared. Or, more to the point, 1181 times the square root of 2. So this is 1,670. So the standard deviation, as we see, doesn't increase at the same rate as the mean. So by consolidating these two into one product, we can get savings with regards to serving the customer, with regards to how much inventory we need in order to serve the customer. Now, we could set up a good old news vendor question, couldn't we here? Find an overage cost, a shortage cost, find a critical ratio. And based on this, we could see how much we need to order. And from this, we could find out expected sales, expected lost sales, and we could find out the savings from pooling these two products into one. And what we find, if we had taken the two suits separately, each had their own inventory and each had their own safety stock, and we find out what the critical ratio is, and we sell to, we order that amount, and of course that gives us expected sales, expected lost sales, expected profit. Well, our total expected profit in this case would be, if they were separate, $383,520. If we had one universal wetsuit here, well, the profit would be about $402,000. So we make about 510 fewer wetsuits, but get $18,000 in profit more. That's the advantage of product pooling. It allows us to make less, but make more money from making less. So, product pooling is most effective when a couple of things occur. When the coefficient of variation of the universal product is lower than the coefficient of variation of the individual products. And also, it tends to be most effective when there is negative correlation in the demand for the individual products. So, let me give an example. What's meant by negative correlation? The higher the sales of one, the lower the sales of the other. If that occurs, then we will get a lot of savings from product pooling. We'll get more savings from product pooling. If there's positive correlation, in other words, the more sales of one that we have, the more sales of the other we get, well, then that makes product pooling less effective. So, what we want with product pooling is, ideally, we want this negative correlation between the sales of the two, where if more is sold of one, less is sold of the other. One of the best examples of product pooling that you will find in recent business, in late 1990s, around 1998 or so, Apple had over a dozen products, almost close to 20. And at this point, Steve Jobs came back. Apple was in trouble. They'd very much lost their way. Steve Jobs came back and he asked a very simple question. Why do you have all of these different products? Or more to the point, with each individual product, why do you have this product? And in most cases, the executives existing there could not give an answer. Well, if you don't understand why you have one product, perhaps it's a good idea not to have that product. And so what Jobs did is he reduced the number of products there down to about a half dozen. Reduced it down to the iMac. At this point, this was when these were just coming out. The iMac, the iBook, the PowerBook. There was one server computer as well, but reduced it from well over a dozen different products down to about 5 or 6, all in the span of a couple of years. So, by consolidating the products, Apple didn't need to hold as much inventory while still being able to serve the customer. Now, product pooling can have its drawbacks. First of all, if you have customers who have particular needs, if you start combining products, you may not provide the functionality that those customers need. Also, it may be more expensive to produce if you're putting in additional functionality to serve multiple groups of customers. That said, it is possible that the universal design will reduce the expenses because, well, you have greater volumes of each component. That causes good old economies of scale to occur. So there may be some drawbacks with regards to this. Also, by having fewer products, you may reduce your ability to access certain target markets, certain product segments. And with the next video, we'll go over things like lead time distribution and capacity pooling and see how these work. And well, thank you.